need 3 of them. I mean, we need 2 of them. But
I'm going to go to fight with them.
okay.
There you go.
All right. All right.
That was good on you.
This one. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir. Welcome back to the Palin Room at Libraries and Archives Canada. Je suis Leslie Weir, bibliothécaire et archiviste du Canada, et je suis ravie d'être avec vous pour le premier événement public à Bibliothèque et Archives Canada en 2023. Wow! Et puis, je tiens à souligner que Bibliothèque et Archives Canada détient les histoires des Premières Nations, des Inuits et de la nation métisse, de la partie nord de l'île de la Tortue, maintenant appelée Canada. Nous reconnaissons que sans la vérité, on ne peut y avoir de réconciliation. And this evening, we're gathered here together on the unceded traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, and we recognize them as the caretakers of this land in the past, in the present, and in the future. I can't think of a better way to celebrate our country's remarkable talent than by sending Canadian books out to the world using Libraries and Archives Canada as a springboard. I would like to welcome this evening our special guests, Catherine Clark, broadcaster, entrepreneur, writer, Neil Wilson, Development Director, Ottawa International Writers Festival, and of course, our author, the Right Honourable David Johnston. Merci d'être venu à cette soirée qui s'annonce très enrichissante. Libraries and Archives Canada is proud to partner with the Ottawa International Writers Festival to present this event and celebrate the power of the written word. Nous sommes toujours ravis de collaborer avec nos partenaires pour organiser des événements publics axés sur la créativité. Collaboratively, we can mobilize our respective networks to promote critical thinking, recognize Canadian culture, and reach greater audiences. This evening, we gather to celebrate the launch of Empathy, Turning Compassion into Action, by none other than David Johnston, one of Canada's most respected, accomplished, and treasured Governors General. Academic, author, statesman, David Johnston has authored or co-authored more than 30 books. This evening, we will discover his most personal and timely work to date, a passionate and practical guide for turning empathy into action. Mr. Johnston's motto, Compléter Meliora, meaning to envisage a better world, refers to his belief in the abilities of all Canadians to imagine and create a smarter, more caring nation and contribute to a fairer, more just world. In that same vein, Empathy, Turning Compassion into Action, is a how-to manual for a world craving kindness. It highlights the inherent goodness of people and how exercising the instinct for kindness creates societies that are intelligent and considerate. Through poignant stories and crisp observations, the author looks at a number of issues that demand our attention, including education, immigration, healthcare, and criminal justice. In each of these areas and more, David Johnston highlights the deeper understandings that have arisen during the COVID-19 crisis. He contends that everyone has power over some things that other people don't. When they learn ways to turn that power into action, they can change the future dramatically. With that powerful thought in mind, I so look forward to hearing more from our author this evening and the discussion on this poignant work. Bibliothèque et Archives Canada organise des événements comme celui-ci pour appuyer les arts et la culture dans nos pays. Nous sommes déterminés à aider les auteurs à prospérer. Bravo et merci à toutes les personnes impliquées. And now, I'll turn things over to my dear colleague, Neil Wilson, of the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Leslie, and good evening, everyone. And a special shout out to those watching from home. Over the past 25 years, the Ottawa International Writers Festival has partnered with Library and Archives Canada in celebrating some of the finest writers and thinkers, and it is always a very special occasion to convene here in what some of us think is Canada's greatest national resource. As Leslie mentioned, tonight we continue our partnership of excellence with David Johnston, Canada's 28th Governor-General and best-selling author, with his latest book, Empathy, written with Brian Hannington. Our good friends from Perfect Books on Elgin Street have copies of the book, which Mr. Johnston will be signing up here at the front. We salute the work of our independent bookstores, who offer an invaluable service to the reading public and are vital to the cultural life of our communities. So please do support them. Patrick Modiano, the 2014 Nobel laureate in literature, was quoted in a recent interview saying, "Good books make good people." A book that profoundly moves or thrills you makes you a more sensitive person and therefore a better one. I know many of us feel as though we're just re-emerging from a 3-year hibernation, COVID hibernation, only to find our world turned upside down and in many ways unrecognizable. We spend much of our time searching for answers or questions that might help us navigate this new world. Empathy is a how-to manual for a world seeking light. Our moderator tonight was named one of Ottawa's 40 under 40 by the Ottawa Board of Trade. Catherine Clark is a nationally respected broadcaster, writer, MC, and the co-founder of the popular podcast, The Honest Talk. She is president of Catherine Clark Communications, a consultancy which provides strategic communications advice and support to institutions, corporations, and individuals. She also hosted and co-produced 2 historical documentaries. Catherine is chair of the board of the Writers' Trust of Canada. She sits on the board of governors of the Ottawa Hospital and serves as a member of the organizing committee of the Politics and the Pen Gala. And this is an abbreviated version of her CV. Catherine is also the daughter of 2 remarkable Canadians and best-selling authors, the Right Honourable Joe Clark and Maureen McTeer. Now, please welcome the star of our show, the Right Honourable David Johnston, and our moderator, Catherine Clark.
We'll share. Thank you. I was saying to Mr. Johnson that I hope his lipstick survived unscathed underneath the mask. I won't even worry about mine at this point. Just what a delight. Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue ici à cet événement très spécial, Quay. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for showing up in such immense numbers for such a wonderful and remarkable human being, David Johnston. It is just a delight to be here with you. Thank you very much for including me tonight, and thank you for writing this book.
Ça marche? C'est bon?
C'est bon.
Je veux dire un très grand merci à vous, Catherine, pour être ici comme modérateur de cette soirée. Je suis ravi et merci. Et merci aussi à Leslie pour une introduction très, très généreuse. Merci. Et Neil aussi. Et nous sommes très heureux nous sommes ici comme invités des Bibliothèques et Archives de Canada et les Fêtes des écrivains d'Ottawa. Merci infiniment. Et je dois saluer mon partenaire Brian Henning qui est ici. And I should say that Brian is not only a dear, dear friend and just a great writer, but he's managed to pull out of me secrets that I didn't think I would ever disclose. Congratulations, Brian. If I have buried my soul, it's because of you. Sorry, can't hear? Not functioning
You're
now?
back. You're back.
Back, that's great. Alors, c'est un plaisir.
Well, and Brian, why don't you stand up, if you don't mind, and give a little wave as well so that everyone can acknowledge you. And the other thing I'd like to do, because Neil mentioned my own family background, and so I am very attuned to the fact that that sometimes one member of a family gets a little bit more public attention than the other members of the family. Of course, I know Mrs. Johnston wouldn't really mind one way or the other, but I'm going to make her stand up, and I'd love to have all members of the clan stand up and give a wave as well, because there's a collection of them here tonight. Okay, you see, the rest of the family is ignoring my request entirely. But they're here, I promise you. So I have had a chance to read Empathy. Many of you in this room may also have had that opportunity. If not, now's your chance. Plenty of books up here at the front of the room. I know you're all going to go home with at least 1 and maybe 10 copies, and that Mr. Johnston will be signing them as soon as we're done. Et je voulais également dire que oui, cet événement est en anglais. The majority of this event will be in English. Mais si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez les poser en français, aucun problème. Nous allons répondre. Monsieur Johnston va répondre en français. There is a mic which is going to be set up here in the aisle, and we will go to questions. I think fairly early. I think you'd really like to hear what what all of you here in the audience have to say. So if you think of a question, please keep it, because we are going to get to your questions as quickly as we can. I was thinking actually before coming here tonight that if you don't know David Johnston, you still think he's a wonderful person. Those of us who know him know he is a wonderful person, but even if you don't know him, you think, what a wonderful man. And I was struck by Madam Justice Rosalie Abella's foreword, where she says, her first sentence is, empathy is not simply the title of David Johnston's book, it's the title of David Johnston's life. And what a wonderful way to begin this exceptional book. I wanted to begin by asking you about the fact that this is one of several books. We heard that from Neil and from Leslie in the lead up to this event. You have dedicated a tremendous amount of time to sharing your thoughts about this country, about our institutions, about innovation. And your last book was about trust. And trust is something that I think we can all intuitively understand. It's an essential part of our personal and our professional interactions, our community interactions. But maybe empathy is something that intuitively we don't think of in quite the same way. Let's start by talking about why empathy was so important to you. Why write a book about empathy?
Well, Catherine, let me begin by speaking of dedication. This book is dedicated to my bespoke family, Sharon, our 5 daughters, our 5 sons-in-law, and our 14 grandchildren, some of whom are right here. But as we get into our conversation, I will emphasize that empathy is a learned habit or learned custom. And I really learned it from Sharon, and then my children, and now my grandchildren. And to them, I just owe such an enormous debt. What is empathy? Empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is I feel sorry for you. Empathy is I see your situation, and I come and walk in your shoes, and we deal with your situation together. And that notion of reaching across from one's self-absorption to the needs of others is really the core of empathy. And it is related to trust. Trust and empathy, I think, are two sides of the same coin, and hope is in the middle. And empathy, I think, precedes trust. One must begin with a consciousness of the other, of reaching out beyond oneself to have some understanding of another person's situation, and then identification with that, and then the positive part of empathy is doing something about it. And that's what this book is about. It's positive empathy, how we make that move. It's a funny word. It actually is quite recent in our lexicon. It came about around 1900 from a German word, Einverlang, which essentially means something a little more emotional than empathy as such. Einverlang is identifying with something in a very deep and passionate way. And it may be music, it may be a piece of art, it may be a book, etc. But one jumps into it and becomes fully involved with that particular thing. As a matter of fact, Shakespeare, who knew a thing or two about empathy, in his play Othello, I'm told it was acted in the late 19th century in Idaho. And in one of the closing scenes, Iago has persuaded Othello that Desdemona, his wife, in fact, has betrayed him mischievously and falsely. And Othello shoots Desdemona. And a member of the audience, a cowboy, was so taken by this and so moved by it, he got up and shot the actor. So that's empathy taken to a bit of an extreme, but it does mean empathy in action, but just be sure it's positive and has some rings around it.
We will hope for no such action tonight.
Catherine, just into the sequence, Sharon and I had the privilege of being at Rideau Hall for 7 years from 2010 to 2017, and what an enormous privilege it was. And my installation address was entitled A Smart and Caring Nation, A Call to Service. And then we began trying to figure out what it meant to be smart and caring and how we could reinforce Canadian values. Sharon had a particular emphasis on mental health, where she has done just yeoman's work and continues to do so. My approaches were a little broader, and embraced a number of things, looking back at the values, the fundamental values of Canadians that had been expressed and articulated and supported in Governors General going back to 1867. And so as one gives speeches and so on, I began to write a series of books with Brian's help. The first was The Idea of Canada, Letters to a Nation, which expressed some of these values. The second was a book on innovation, because I believe innovation, doing things better, is a very fundamental part of trust and empathy. And we did a children's book that is called Ingenious for young people. So the children's book is in almost all the primary schools in the country, and the adults book in all of the secondary schools of the country. Again, just to encourage the notion of innovating, doing things better. And then we wrote Trust, which was motivated in part by my concern about eroding trust in our public institutions, but it became a wider subject. And then Empathy, which came along, which, as I say, is one side of the coin with trust on the other side. So that's the history.
A lot of people might suggest, looking out at the world these days, where there is political division, where there's a war in Ukraine, where there is, as you've mentioned, a loss of trust in our institutions. They might be forgiven for thinking that there's not a lot of empathy going around. Do you share that concern?
Yeah, I think it's in shorter supply, clearly, than it should be, Catherine, and I think we've seen a diminution in empathy and also trust over the past several decades, as measured a number of ways. Why is that so? Well, I think we're at a kind of a hinge point in history. And if you look at the change from 1945 on, we had a period of time where Pax Americana was quite important, I think, to maintaining a degree of minimized conflict in the world, although the atomic bomb and nuclear was there. I think that served us well. Imagine, a victorious nation, the United States with the Allies, actually putting their enemies back on their feet, Japan and Germany and others, after World War II. We haven't seen that much in history. But that was a period of time until about the turn of the century, 2000, where, one, we saw the international order prevailing over the world. We saw World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods Agreement. We saw the United Nations developing other international organizations, a kind of international rule of law that I think reduced conflict, reinforced trust in democratic institutions, and caused us to think a little bit more about our neighbor. That's fallen away. A number of reasons. Pax America has diminished. That international order has been somewhat cast asunder. Globalization hasn't lived up to some of its promises, left a lot of people beside. We had the global financial crisis of 2008, which was quite dramatic, and we may get into this when we speak a bit about business. But it's a situation where investment bankers and others, mainly in Wall Street and capitalist sector, capitalized the profits and socialized the losses. The losses were borne by the taxpayer and others, and that was a pretty fundamental change, I think. And then, of course, we had climate change, which has grown and grown as a concern. We had COVID, which has been a real onslaught for us. We have this unbelievably tragic war with the invasion by the Russians into the Ukraine. And more recently, the nuclear threat has returned to us. And I think that has put in a period of instability, along with the digital revolution, which really has changed the way we interact with one another. The printing press took 3 centuries to reach a majority of the population of Western Europe from the 15th century to the 18th century. A majority of the population. The internet took less than a decade to reach a majority of the population of the world. And the digital way of thinking and communication is different than the written word was, which transformed Western Europe. And I think we're still coming to grips with this new important technological advance, which is digitalization, but learning the rules of the road, which are pretty rudimentary at this point.
You talked at the beginning about having learned empathy. I have to admit, I find that a little surprising. I really think you probably came out as a very empathetic person. But how do you learn empathy? I mean, you talked about Mrs. Johnson teaching you, your kids teaching you.
Yeah.
But what did you learn? I mean, when did you realize that what you were learning was empathy?
Yeah, I think through my teenage years, Catherine, I think it's both nature and nurture. I think we human beings actually are born with a genetic disposition to interact with one another and to care for one another, beginning with a mother and her child, of course. But I think the learning is a very important part of it. And I began to learn empathy with my wife, Sharon, and then having children together. I grew up in a very modest family. My home life was that I started work at age 8, and I knew if I wanted a new bicycle or a new pair of blue jeans, you earned the money to get them, and that was that. In a wonderful community, Sault Ste. Marie, and it takes a village to raise a child, and it was a village that raised me. I was Sharon's first date when she was 13 in high school, and this poor woman has tolerated me for 57, 56 years of marriage. And I
really don't want to get that wrong at this point.
I just give, as I learned empathy, I remember Sharon was about 16 at this time, and I was with her, and her French teacher came over to her home, and she gave Sharon a French dictionary to say, "You love French, and I want to give you this gift to encourage you." And I was so struck by how emotionally taken Sharon was by this gift. She was filled with joy. And the person, this marvelous French teacher giving her the gift, was also filled with joy. And for me, that penetrated right into my heart. There's something about that joyousness that is so key. And so many other instances, beginning with my children. Debbie is here in the audience right here. Going to embarrass you a bit, Deb. So we were in Cambridge, where we'd spent our first year of marriage, and I did my law degree there. And we were back about 7 or 8 years later for the only sabbatical I've ever had. 6 months was in Cambridge, and we began writing the book called Canadian Securities Regulation there. But we lived in the village of Girton, and we went to church at the Anglican Church, 1,200-year-old church. And Debbie was 4 at the time, and one Sunday morning we got into the pew up near the front, and the service started, and the door at the back opened, and a very disheveled, poor man with a cane came in and crept into the back pew and sat down. He'd been there a couple previous Sundays, so we knew it. And Debbie looked back at him, and then she picked up her art things that she had as a 4-year-old at church. She went back to the pew, and I watched her going back. Where is she going? And she sat down in this pew with this man. She was there for a little bit and handed him something, and then she came back, and I said, what were you doing there? She said, I drew a picture for that man. I said, why did you do that? She said, because he needed a friend. And I gave him a picture of me as my friend. This was a 4-year-old, and that was empathy. And interesting, you know, Deb was about 25, and she was articling in law, and she was co-author with me and another graduate student of mine on a book called The Cyber Law. And we were exploring this new digital revolution and how the functionality of digital communication was an important breakthrough, but law is a very reactive and historic body that tends to react very slowly, and we were wrestling with the notion of how do we help the law to respond more positively, more in anticipation of these things rather than being way, way behind. And I was looking for a value to put on that, and Debbie said, you know, Dad, you got all these values, but the most important one of all is empathy. And so that's what I learned from my children. The trust book, Brian and I decided would be dedicated to children who offer their trust implicitly in the full expectation of fairness, beginning of empathy. And this book is dedicated to my bespoke family, led by Sharon, who have taught me empathy through the years, and I am the lucky beneficiary of having that village that has raised me.
One of the things that I've noticed, and many of us here in this room are parents or grandparents, and I always notice that when we talk to children, sometimes we talk to them a little bit dismissively. When we talk about teenagers, sometimes we talk about them dismissively. And I wondered what you think. I mean, you've just illustrated a wonderful story about a child identifying something that maybe an adult didn't or couldn't. What do we have to learn from children and from teenagers, who are sometimes the most interesting and future-oriented people in the room? What do we have to learn from them about using empathy as we move forward in this new global environment?
Well, I think listening to them an awful lot so that you are empathizing with them and coming to understand their situation, and then being a little bit careful about imposing your own reactions to that, doing a little more listening. And I think to encourage them to develop their own empathetic responses to the world around them and their own decisions. Again, we're so lucky. We had 5 daughters in 7 years, and around about age 12, they began international exchanges, which became part of their life and have been on exchanges or academic pursuits or volunteers or whatever in something like 20 different countries around the world. But from age 12, when they began an exchange with a family in Lyon, France, who had part of the relatives here on the same street as us in Montreal, I watched 4 things develop in the formation, the development of my daughters. One, they became more curious. All kids are curious. They ask why. And sometimes we parents say, oh, stop asking me these crazy questions. Why? You go play outside, whatever. But the why became more penetrating. And secondly, they became more tolerant. Not just, you're different from me, that's okay, nobody gets hurt. But I'm interested in what's different about you. As Saint-Exupéry says in Le Petit Prince, I am different from you, but I do not diminish you, I enrich in you. And the third thing that happened is their judgment became better. They didn't accept the first bit of evidence. Like a good engineer, they triangulated to look at things from several different angles. We were very quick to spot bigotry and cherry-picked evidence, etc. Judgment was really important. But the most important thing of all was empathy. They learned to be empathetic with other people. And I guess if I were king for a day of the world, one, I would ensure that every girl child had at least the same equal opportunity for education as every boy child. And I would encourage coming here to have as much international travel as we can. Our university and college students should, I think, have as part of their education exposure to a different culture, etc. And we in Canada, I think, should become the Athens to the new Rome's, to be the place where people from anywhere in the world would want to come and study, because our education system is so good, but we're so welcoming to new ideas and want that mix and so on. And I'll just finish with one other story about learning. Sharon and I are honorary witnesses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the 3 duties of honorary witnesses are: 1 is to listen carefully to the history,
Two, to see the evidence of that history, the past and the current. And then thirdly, to go and bear witness, to encourage other people to have that same kind of experience. One of the initiatives that I'm most excited about at the Rita Hall Foundation is an Indigenous Teachers Program, where, thanks to wonderfully generous support from the MasterCard Foundation and with great support from Universities and Colleges Canada, we're embarking upon educating 10,000 young Indigenous students to become teachers over the next decade or decade and a half. And that's so fundamentally important on the road to reconciliation, because education is the new buffalo. And if we reach out to our Indigenous co-citizens and understand their history and understand the damage of the residential schools, perhaps well-intentioned as they were, how do we bring them into this wonderful Canada with equality of opportunity for all? And education is so key. And I think that particular initiative, of all the ones we're taking in reconciliation steps and showing the appropriate amount of empathy, positive action, I think that will be a very key one.
It sounds like an exceptional program, and I agree on the education front. I think the other key element is that we're now educating an entire generation of young people who are actually learning the real history and who are able to take that in and to teach then their own children, so that, you know, generationally through education we will break a cycle and be able to hopefully at some point, at some day, achieve full and true reconciliation. I was telling you that, so when you were Governor General, you had essentially a motto, a smart and caring nation. You mentioned it a few moments ago. And reading this book helped me to understand what that actually meant. I mean, they were nice words, it sounded great, but this book actually breaks down into almost a guidebook at the end of each chapter. And once you've had a chance to read it, you'll see that at the end of each segment, Mr. Johnston and Brian have broken it down into a series of steps that we can each take. We can take them as individuals, we can take them as communities, we can take them as nations. Why that breakdown? Why providing that step-by-step element? Why was that important?
Well, I think because Brian and I are very practical people, and those were practical consequences. It's wonderful to talk about idealistic notions like empathy and trust and so on, but how do you put it into action? How do you do something about it? So that's what we did at the end of each chapter. We looked first of all at the individual, secondly from a community level, thirdly from a national level. What is it we can do within our own power to exercise positive empathy? And then, just to go a little bit further, we also, at the end of each chapter, and the publishers suggested we put this in appendix because it was getting a little detail, we give a recommendation of 3 or 4 books or 3 or 4 films that emphasize or dramatize, perhaps not quite as strongly as Shakespeare's Othello with the fellow that shot the actor in Idaho, but would carry one with further applications in this. And it's intended, I think, to say, you know, empathy is within all of our grasp, and here are some very practical things we can do about it. I think it's also very Canadian, Catherine. You know, there are so many...
We like practical steps.
Yeah, well, very much practical steps, but you know, this is really a very good country, and we have certainly challenges and things to do, but U.S. News and World Report, for example, which ranks the most livable countries in the world, for the last 3 or 4 years, Canada has been in the top 3. It's been #1 in the last year, et cetera. And I think we should never forget that, without being arrogant about it. It is a wonderful country. It's a blessed country, and it's a good country if we can also realize that we have shortcomings and we can do something about it. And I guess that's why I feel so passionate about empathy and trust and things like this, to take this country and move it a notch better, and to say to the rest of the world, not arrogantly do what we're doing, but follow that kind of example and move from the notion of the glorification of the individual to the notion of the common good, of civic virtue, of looking after one another's neighbor. You know, all of the great religions of the world actually come down to the golden rule: do unto others as you would do unto yourself. And I just been reminiscing about the Queen with her passing, and what she meant to us. And positive empathy was a big part of it. I characterized three things about Queen Elizabeth. One is her personal graciousness that you wouldn't see in formal ceremonies, but face-to-face, she was a wonderfully gracious, thoughtful, and caring person. Secondly, she epitomized leader as servant, not leader as the great I, me, but leader as serving whatever particular cause. But the third thing was her values, and they arose from her Christian faith, which was very much her rock. But it didn't exclude the Christian faith. She embraced other faiths as well. And in her Christmas message, she always referred to biblical passages. And the one that she referred to most often was the Good Samaritan. You remember that's the story of the Samaritan from a hostile tribe to the tribe of Judea. A merchant was beset upon by thieves and was left for death in a ditch. And shortly thereafter, a Pharisee from the Judea tribe came along and saw the man and walked quickly by. And a scribe, again, and one of the elite came by and saw this man in the ditch and walked by. A few minutes later, a Samaritan from a hostile tribe comes and sees this man in a ditch and rushes over, binds his wound, takes him to an inn, pays for whatever is necessary for him to recover, etc. And that Samaritan was an enmity. It wasn't the immediate neighbor. And the notion of love thy neighbor is not simply people who are your immediate kin, but reach across, etc. And that's, I think our troubled world needs more Samaritans.
Can we build on that also and talk about how we can use empathy to deal with some of the major issues that we are facing as a global civilization? You mentioned climate change.
Yeah.
We are gathered again while COVID still continues.
Yeah.
How can empathy be used to help us build towards
Yeah.
solutions?
Well, I think they're both tests. Climate change and COVID are two different pestilences, or two different challenges, but they're huge. Climate change, which has been building, of course, for 30 or 40 years and becoming more acute. COVID, which has just been part of our lexicon in the last 2 or 3 years. But what both teach us, first of all, just to quote Warren Buffett in a little different context, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And when the tide goes out, or an epidemic comes like COVID, you see where your systems break down. And as we see the manifestation of climate change, which is real and harsh and tragic, we see the weaknesses in our system. And what I think both of those terrible challenges have taught us is our mutual vulnerability, that we are and must be our neighbor's friend, and indeed people on the opposite side of the world who are not very close to us. One, when a virus jumps from an animal to a human being, as we believe it did in Wuhan, China, it affects not only Chinese people, it affects all the people in the world. And we need collaborative antennae so that we see these things together and then deal with them together in ways that involve not just protecting our own immediate family, but protecting others, because that's part of us. And that applies equally to climate change. One of the most interesting task forces I've ever chaired was the National Round Table on the Environment and the Economy in 1989. Prime Minister Mulroney who was quite an environmental prime minister, I should say, who was quite taken by the Brundtland United Nations report on sustainable development, which became a term of our lexicon. Sustainable development is just dealing with your environment today so that our future generation will be able to deal with it equally with the same blessings in the future. And he set up a national roundtable, asked me to chair it, and what was interesting about the roundtable concept is we had 16 people, 4 ministers of government, 4 CEOs of major corporations that were involved in environmental kinds of things, chemicals, oil, etc. Then 4 people who were from the environmental movement, and then 4 people who were policy people or academics or researchers like myself. And it lasted for about 20 years, which is very unusual for a task force. They usually come with one government and disappear with the other. But this was an important one. And the very first thing we did was to develop the definition of sustainable development and used it as a test for public legislation emerging from the Government of Canada in the years to come. And that's was a first big step, I think, in us being much more conscious of the environment. But the other thing was that there was a kinship that developed around those 16 people. that meant we could be frank with one another and we could come to understand one another's perspective. And it took a little while. Meeting two, Mike Wilson, the Minister of Finance, was there. Lucien Bouchard, Minister of Environment. Harvey Andre from Calgary was there as the Resources Minister. And he said at the beginning of two, he said to the four environmentalists, this thing is going off the rails. He said, you have a choice. You can be Cardinal Richelieu or you can be Lech Walesa. And they said, what does that mean? Well, Lech Walesa was leading the Polish protest then before the Guard Curtain fell and was in the news all the time, pillaring the government as appropriately he should. Cardinal Richelieu was the courtier to several of the French kings who managed to accomplish many things by working with them and through them, etc. And our environmentalists left for a little bit, led by one of them, Judge Barry Stewart, came back and said, let's try Cardinal Richelieu. And that's what we did. And there was frankness there in that body. One, being prepared to listen to the other person's situation and come to understand it, and then try to find the concentric circles where our interests came together. Two, then, was to say, you know, what practically do we do out of that kind of consensus? And then number three, trying to be very conscious of being effective in what it is you're doing from beyond that. And I think that's why it lasted for 20 years. It actually was effective, particularly in influencing the decisions of government, because it brought voices in that are not normally heard around the cabinet table.
I'd like to go to audience questions. So if you have a question, pop up. We have a microphone that's just in the center aisle that we're getting ready right now. While we do that, let me ask one other question of you, which is that this is a very personal book. You do speak about things related to your family and to experiences that you shared, which, you know, I think which many of us didn't know much about. Was there a sense that now is the time, you're still very much a public figure, but you no longer hold an office which requires you to perhaps be a little bit more cautious about what you say, though you are extremely diplomatic in all things. But did you feel that now is a time when you can be a little bit freer in telling these kinds of stories about your family and the life that you've led up to this point?
Yeah, I think somewhat, Catherine. You know, when people use the title Right Honorable, and I say, please don't use those titles, I often think, if I'm right honorable, shouldn't I also be left honorable? After all, I'm supposed to be nonpartisan, you know.
I just have to say there was once, actually, my dad talks about having both that as a nameplate once, but also one that he kept, which referred to him as the bright honorable, and he felt that one should be framed.
As always, we imitate your dad. Yeah, good. Sure. I mean, I'm 81 years old, so you know, I have no secrets to hold, etc. And I think I've become probably less concerned about, you know, the many faults in my character, etc., as life goes on, etc. And so many of the lessons I've learned in life have come from making mistakes and overcoming them, and I write about some of those in the book, including, you know, for my children. Sam, our number 5 daughter, who's in Boston, who's not here, said to me one time, Dad, if I were chairman of the board of the University of Waterloo, I'd fire you. Roseanne Runtup, my great friend, president of Carleton University, is there. You never had that said to you, Roseanne, but my daughter was saying it to me. And what she was saying is, you know, you're supposed to be a university that's all about innovation, but you still let professors use old notes and read their lectures and the kids scribble them down. You know, that's only about 15% learning efficient. If you really want to get learning efficiency, you have to have them act on what it is they're learning, and then it gets up to 75 or 80%. So, you know, you're living and learning all the time. And I guess, you know, I tell personal stories, Catherine, because I've just learned so much and learned so much from others. The title of my installation address I mentioned was A Smart and Caring Country, and I'm still learning how that means, how we put it into action. And the 7 years that Sharon and I spent in Rideau Hall was a wonderful kind of microscope on Canada to try to understand that. But I said in that address in the Senate just down the road, I said, if you remember only 3 words of what I say today, they are cherish our teachers, cherish our teachers, because apart from our family, they have the most influence on us. And I said if we had 3 or 4 more hours here, I'd tell you 100 stories of teachers, mentors, coaches that have made a huge difference in my life. And I've just been lucky enough, I think, to see a number of those and to say, what's special about that person, and why do I emulate what they do and try very faithfully to follow it?
Well, we do have a question, and it is Roseanne O'Reilly-Rente. Hello, welcome. I hope the mic works. Let's check it out.
Oh, I think it
There you
does.
go. Wonderful, wonderful.
This is just such a privilege to hear you, David, and thank you for this book. I think all of us are empathetic people, and all of us struggle to find the words and the ways to show empathy. We all have tough times in life, and to find the words to comfort someone else, it's one of the hardest things that we can do. So I have 2 questions for you, and they're really easy questions because you're so brilliant. The first,
This is a test.
the first one is the next book going to be called Hope? And the second
Sorry,
one,
the first one is?
okay,
Say it again.
is the next book going to be called Hope?
Yeah, Hope or the Volunteer. One or 2 of those topics. Brian, I'll have to stir myself my lethargy for us to be able to do that.
And the second question is, without giving too much away from the book, when we all express our empathy and we look as individuals, as communities, and as a nation, we are still going to be drowned out by fake news and
Sure.
hate. What is the solution? How can empathy win?
Yeah. First of all, let me just say, Roseanne, you'll have a wonderful book on innovation, which we'll see in about 5 or 6 months, I think. Yeah, Simon & Schuster, so we'll look for that as well. Well, number one, it's really the only path forward. Let the pessimists and the Cassandras of the world have their time in saying we're going to hell in a handbasket. We're not, particularly not in this nation, and there are just too many good people that share the kind of values that we've expressed in this book. It's also I think the only way that we can live our lives. If you live in a shadow of things are awful, they can never be better, etc. You're pretty miserable and you don't accomplish very much, and you get pretty wrapped up in yourself, I think. Yeah, fake news is with us, but let's use the power of the pen, the power of thought, and overcome that, etc. And manage the digital revolution that has brought new ways of communicating with one another. I say to young people, I'll illustrate the answer with David Brooks' book. David Brooks is an editorialist for the New York Times, writes about social capital. His second last book is called The Two Mountains. And he speaks about the first mountain of people, marvelous, accomplished people like Roseanne and so many of you people in this room who've sort of climbed that mountain of achievement and have the respect and admiration of their peers and so on. I think have a kind of satisfaction of, I'm running the race and I'm doing it well. He said if you're really lucky climbing up that first mountain, you'll look across the valley to a second mountain where other people are toiling up that mountain, but not at the same pace and with not reaching the same plateaus and not the same acclaim that you have received, etc. And you'll see some of them in need. And if you're really lucky, you'll take the journey across the valley and you'll walk with them and help them along the way. And the happiness that you feel or satisfaction on the first mountain will turn from satisfaction to joy. C.S. Lewis's wonderful title of his book, Surprised by Joy. I illustrate that in one of my great friends that I made becoming GG is Walter Tinchuk, who was Chief of Defense Staff at that time, now Deputy Minister of Veterans Affairs. Walt and I became great chums, and when he stepped down, he honored me by inviting me to his retirement ceremony, where the custom is only the immediate mates, those who were with him through cadets, through RMC, through early days in his military career, etc. No brass, no outsiders. And I was there and I was so thrilled. And Walt, in his closing speech, said, I'm a really lucky guy, born in this country, Canada, Polish Canadian, grew up north side of Winnipeg, poor as can be, became an Army cadet, and here became Chief of Defense Staff. But he said, I was 35 and I was made lieutenant colonel, and I was responsible for my own military group. And I was in cloud nine. Nobody expected I would rise that quickly. And he said after about 24 hours, that sort of joy and pride kind of diminished, and something changed in me. And all of a sudden, I realized I was responsible for the careers and the lives of the 1,000 people under my command. And this ceased to be about Walt Matinchuk, and it became about them. And I say to young people, when I tell the story about Walt, that you're a 16 or 17-year-old, and the universe is, you are the center of it, etc. If you can just, for a moment, sort of put that off and look over to the person that needs your help, etc., and enter their world to help them along, you'll find that a great weight comes off your shoulders, and life is a whole lot more interesting than it's not all about you, but it's about the person next to you.
Yeah, I think that's
my answer.
Yeah.
There's a book, Robert Putnam is the former dean of the Kennedy School of Government, writes about social capital. His latest book is called The Upswing, and he traces American history from the 1880s, the Gilded Age, up through a pinnacle period of about 1960, and then back down in inverted V, with I, the first person singular, here at the bottom, and the collectivity, the social capital, the public good up here. In the Golden Age, the robber barons, the glamorous people, rising prosperity, it was very much an individualistic society. And gradually over the period from the 1880s up to 1960s, remember Kennedy's famous speech, ask not what the government can do, your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, to the notion of the collectivity. And then it had a very rapid descent. He finished writing in 2018 after the change of the presidency, and it looked pretty dismal. But he said it's the upswing because the seeds of the rebirth of America in the collectivity, in civic virtue, in the public good is there and will come back. And I believe it's alive and well in this country. Sometimes it's a little bit overcome by the shouted voices, but the good people in this country, I think, are strong enough and tough enough that we'll put this one aside.
Next question, over to you.
Good evening.
Bonsoir.
I won't be as eloquent as Dr. Runte, and I'm trying to formulate the question. But here, Chapter 1, Learn from the Young. I had the privilege of being interviewed with an 8-year-old girl, and boy, did I learn. And she did much better in the interview than I did. Briefly, the interviewer asked her, you raised some money? And she says, yep, like every 8-year-old would say. And then she said, how much money did you raise? $764.10.
8 years old.
8 years old. Then Sam LaPrade says, well, tell me more. She says, well, we went to Algonquin College. We made some ionized pet tags. We got some seed funding, and we have our mentor, Steve. So Sam LaPrade says, how old are you, Emma? And she says, I'm 8. That story depicts that I learned a tremendous amount from that young person. But in today's workforce, we have 5 generations. How can we intergenerationally learn from each other? What I tell the students that I'm working with is that I learn a tremendous amount from you, and you could learn a little bit from me. So my question is, are we maximizing that intergenerational storytelling and passing of experience?
We are, and we should be, and that story is quite wonderful. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of our grandchildren here today. I could tell stories of that kind about all of them. Nick, why don't I tell your story? Were you 8 at your school when you started the book sale? 8 or 9? How old were you, Nick? 9. So our family were very involved with the private support of Syrian refugees, and Roger and Sharon, Nick's mom and dad, are both docs, and their particular approach was to contribute their medical services to the community group that came together to sponsor some Syrian refugees. And Deb did her own thing in her way, and Jen, our number 4 daughter, and their children did some in their own way also. So Nick comes home and he says, Mom and Dad, I'd like to do something for the Syrian refugees as well, but I'm not a doctor, I can't. help them with their medical care. I'm just 8 or 9 years old. But he says, you know, we have a lot of books, a lot of children's books, and I'm sort of outgrown them, and maybe we could sell them and raise some money for the Syrian refugees. And lo and behold, Nick went to his teacher, who was one of these positive empathy people, and said, well, we got a problem, Nick, because at our school we do have charitable things, but 3 charities that are the ones that receive our help, and you know we can't go beyond those 3. But then, being a smart lady, she looked at the United Way, which was one of them, and she found 1 or 2 of the supported United Way charities, which were Syrian refugees. So that's how she skated that on side. So Nick got some of his chums, and they put their books together. And, forgotten what they raised in the first year, but then the principal was a smart guy and said we should do this with the whole school. So last year, how much did you raise, Nick, at the book sale at the school? The year before, your last year there? $2,000? $1,500? In that neighborhood, not bad. And Tea's right there beside Nick. So Deb and her family were sponsoring with a group, Syrian refugees, and she wanted to do something, so she and her, a couple of her classmates decided to bake goods, and they sold them at the local market. And I think I said I'd match them 1-to-1. I think when it got up to about $1,500, it got a little bit expensive. And my great friend Scott Haldane, Scott, where are you? Just put up your hand. Scott Haldane, there he is at the back. He went to Chelsea, where they live, to this market one day, and I don't know what he paid for 6 cinnamon buns, but it was an awful lot of money, Scott. And you know, that's from our children. And you know, it spreads. I just stay with the Syrian refugees because it's a very good test example where what was unique about the Canadian response is we had not just government sponsorship, but private sponsorship. And so at Rideau Hall, we brought together a group of people involved in the private sponsorship to exchange stories, how we could manifest that across the country. And then we had some celebrations in different communities of these stories of reaching out this way. We were in Oakville one evening, and there were about 500 people in the auditorium, 250 private sponsor families, and then 250 Syrian refugees and their children. And the opening blessing was given by a priest, Roman Catholic, a Protestant minister, an imam from the mosque, and a rabbi from the temple. And when they finished, I said, you know, it's wonderful to hear 4 of the great religions giving a blessing to this initiative that we celebrate here tonight. But you know, there's something special about those 4 representatives. Their 4 congregations have come together as an entire group to sponsor 9 or 10 Syrian families. And the Protestants looked after the jobs, the Catholics looked after the housing, the imam and the mosque looked after culture and languages, etc., and the Jewish congregation looked after education. And I said, isn't that Canada at its best? Those particular groups working together. That's our country, and that's why we need these stories, and especially when they come from children, they just inspire us.
Thank you.
I think the other moral of that story is if you're a fundraiser in the room, you better come and meet some of the Johnston kids. Get them on side early and young. I'm conscious of time, so I know we have some books to sign. I'd love to give you an opportunity just before we wrap up to say a couple final words, and then we'll get you over to the desk. Just for anyone who's wondering where the book signing is going to take place, it's just here to our left of the stage, and Mr. Johnston will go there immediately after this, so get your books ready and your credit cards out. And final words, final thoughts?
Well, thank you. And the credit cards, all of the royalties go to the Rideau Hall Foundation. Our CEO, Teresa Marcus, is there, and she can tell you a lot about this wonderful organization. But thank you for purchasing those books and encouraging your friends. The other thing I want to say, Catherine, is thank you to you for being such a wonderful moderator and a great example, and all of us for being here. And I don't forget your question, practical things. So I guess my final salutation would be kind to one another and be gentle on yourself. And if you want some practical advice, this book is filled with it because, as we say, at the end of each chapter, we've written some suggestions, some recommendations, individual, community, nation. And then at the back of the book, we've recommended some books and films that you may find interesting as you continue your journey up the second mountain. Thank you. Merci.
Well, and just a very quick, no, that's okay. You have an important job to do, but a very quick thank you to you, Mr. Johnston, for being the person that you are, for being the kind and empathetic and hopeful leader that you are, and thank you to your family for sharing you with us as well. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here this evening. And now we'll get the line started.
I've got to leave one final word. Nick, I thought you were going to ask me what does a cover mean, because you asked that about your granny's book one time at another occasion. So the cover is a bit of a test. The designer is a remarkable person, and it's a bit of abstract art, so you make your own interpretation. But mine is that, number one, a thread is used to fix things up, to stitch them together. And number two, that thread on the two spools is a kind of well of compassion. You see one that's lacking a little bit at the top and one that's filled with a lot of at the bottom. Notice how they're connected, and one moves to the other, etc. And then finally, there's a lovely knot that ties them together. It means that we do tie ourselves one together. That's one person's interpretation. There are 1,000 others.
Okay, but I have to share the story now about what the question was at the book launch, Mrs. Johnston's book launch. So the title of the book was Matrons and Madams. And the question was, Granny, what is a madam? And there was a moment of silence. And then a moment of great laughter, at which point Mrs. Johnston very diplomatically answered the question. I think she may have said, ask your parents.
It's worse than that, Catherine. Nick asked the question, can Granny please explain the title of Matrons and Madams? And matron was her grandmother, who was the superintendent of the hospital in Lethbridge. The madam was a madam who ran a brothel, and they were very good friends. So she gets that question, and my wife, being my wife, says, my chauffeur at the back of the room will answer that question. I'm the chauffeur. So I get up, says to Nick, I said, Nick, I'll explain to you the matron, and your granny will explain to you about the madam.
All right, over to the book signing. Thank you for being a part of this.